So this story all kind of started when a couple members of the public spoke at a city council meeting in June 2022 about some concerns they had and that they had heard from clients who were living at or had lived at Life Moves Mountain View. And so we took those concerns and kind of ran with it. And here we are, 9 months later, which kind of gives an idea of how big of a scope this project became. And that's just something we never could have predicted at the start. So here we are. So, like any good investigative story, we tried to really start by talking to as many people as we could who were directly affected by some of the things that we heard at that council meeting. So first we reached out to the folks who spoke at the council meeting who seemed to have some personal connections with clients, former and current clients. They connected us to a couple initial clients who we spoke to. Those clients connected us to more and more and more, and it kind of snowballed from there. So once we had talked to enough clients, we made sure that people knew they could always be in touch with us. And with many of them, we ended up having multiple conversations, a lot of conversations even after we had begun writing, and some later to fact check things that we wanted to make sure we got right.
Yeah. And then when it came to former staff members, it was just good old-fashioned Googling for some of it. So sometimes clients would say, hey, I've had this or this interaction with a staff member, and we'd say, hey, do you know their full name? Can you share it with us? And from there, if they did share it with us, we would try to find how to get in touch with that person, especially if they were a former staff member. So we sent out a lot of LinkedIn messages. We left voicemails on numbers we found associated with those people. Sometimes folks were surprised that we reached out to them because they didn't know we were going to reach out to them because we had found them online.
Yeah.
And in those cases, sometimes we had folks respond and say, I don't want to be a part of the story. Please don't contact me again. Sometimes folks didn't even respond, but in a lot of cases, a ton of people wanted to talk. Another key piece of the investigation was finding the paper trails to help support what a lot of the clients were telling us, right? So what does that look like? That looks like emails, court records, police records, grievances. And so to be able to find all this hard evidence to help corroborate what nearly 20 people were telling us.
Yeah, so we filed what are called PRAs, that's what we call them in the newsroom. It's a Public Records Act request, and this basically gives us access to emails, even text messages that anyone in the city government is exchanging. And we knew that city officials would probably be talking about Life Moves because many of these shelter programs, and specifically the Mountain View program, are started in partnership with cities and with counties. So we knew folks would be talking about this. And per the Freedom of Information Act, that's something that actually anyone, not just journalists, but any member of the public is entitled to. So most of the emails that turned up from those requests were information we already knew. Maybe in some cases it confirmed information we already knew, generally not groundbreaking for the investigation. But in a couple instances, emails that we received kind of completely changed the course of our investigation. And one of those in particular was, so throughout this process, we were trying to get an interview with the CEO of Life Moves, but he never actually agreed to sit down and be interviewed with us, despite many attempts by us reporters. But what we did have was an email that the CEO had written to upper management in Life Moves, which ordinarily we wouldn't have access to through a PRA. But because that email was eventually forwarded to city staff, we actually got to see it. And in that email, the CEO confirmed what a lot of our investigation had been leading us to, which is that the numbers, the exit rates, the statistics coming out of Life Moves Mountain View are a little concerning. They're underwhelming. So getting that email, especially when the CEO was not going to sit down for an interview with us, that was huge for our investigation.
So we started writing these stories in mid-November, and that gives a sense of how much groundwork needed to go into investigating before we could write, because we started reporting in mid-June, right? So we spoke to clients, public officials, experts. We probably have like upwards of 35 hours of interviews that we conducted. We were gathering public records, right? And then in mid-November, we finally started writing. But we kept talking to people and finding documents well into the writing process as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And pretty soon into that writing process, I would say probably a month or less in, it became pretty evident and clear to us that the story would need to be 2 parts. And that wasn't so much because of the length of the story. It is lengthy, but it was more because we started to see a really distinct two kind of buckets that this story was falling into. We could see the client testimonies and complaints and issues that were really specific to Life Moves Mountain View. Things like dirty bathrooms and mismanagement and people's concerns not being heard. But then we were also seeing these underlying systemic issues that contribute to those things happening. So things like staffing challenges, things like lack of affordable housing. That was the really big one that kind of solidified a need for a part two, was to really dive into how is the state's housing crisis and lack of affordable housing making it really hard for programs like Life Moves to be successful, because they're a housing first model. The whole goal is to house clients, but there's no housing. At least that's what we discovered in talking to experts in the field.
Yeah.
So as journalists, deciding what goes into the story or what doesn't make the story is one of the hardest parts of our job, especially when we're reporting on a big enterprise type story like this. We ultimately spoke to almost 20 former and current clients, and a lot of clients were sharing stories of trauma with us. They were sharing stories about how their concerns weren't heard or met while they were living at this shelter. So people were really opening up to us, and we obviously want to include every story, but we can't always include every story. And so there's certain things that go into deciding what we do or don't include. So it's a really careful balance that we have to strike between finding the most compelling stories that will make readers want to read through the end of our story, but also including as many voices as we can. And in a lot of instances, we heard multiple stories that were along the similar lines of issues, which is helpful to us as journalists because it shows that these issues are real and that they were happening. It corroborates those testimonies. But in many instances, for example, with the bathrooms at Life Moves, that was something that a lot of clients told us they had issues with. Some clients even had to use restrooms at a local YMCA to avoid using Life Moves bathrooms because they were filthy. But we heard that 10 plus times. We only needed to pick out one or two of the most compelling stories to help portray that issue.
Yeah. It's also important that what we chose to include in the story, that it be backed up in more than one way. No matter how powerful or compelling a single client's experience was, it needed to be backed up in more than one way, especially if it was an incident that Life Moves was denying or disputing. So how did we do that? So we relied on paper trails. If someone said that they had said something to staff members and they filed a grievance, that was a way for us to verify. Another way that we did that was we asked folks independently of each other to corroborate one incident, to basically tell the same story of that incident to see if it lined up. And unfortunately what that means is that not every testimony could be included. But every single story we heard was incredibly valuable. They each helped lead us to other sources, to other tips that eventually made the final stories that much stronger. So there are a number of anonymous sources in this story, right? But for the record, we, the reporters, know who those people are. They are just anonymous to the readers. We have spoken to them multiple times. We've met them. They are not anonymous to us. And there are many reasons why we let folks be quoted anonymously in the story. So one of the reasons, we spoke to folks who had experienced domestic violence, people who had experienced sexual assault, and we wanted them to be able to speak to us on the record and not have their name attached to an experience that was so traumatizing in such a permanent and public way. We also had current clients of Life Moves that were nervous of retaliation if their name was connected to negative comments about the program. And then we also had former clients who we realized they had sort of a distrust of the system within the county and within the nonprofits that's meant to protect them and support them, right? They were nervous that if they spoke out against any part of the system, that they would be branded as people that wouldn't get care or shelter or financial assistance from the county or from programs in the future.
But readers can definitely feel confident that we have vetted, we have double, triple fact-checked this story multiple times, whether it's associated with an anonymous source or not. And that's because much of the information, all of the information that ended up in this story was corroborated by more than one source. And sources can be a lot of things. It could be multiple people or documents, paper trails, etc. And that goes for every fact that ended up in this story.